Sometime after midnight on December 18th, 1966, a Lotus Elan was moving fast through the empty streets of South Kensington. Behind the wheel was a 21-year-old man. Beside him, a 19-year-old model named Suki Potier. They had left a friend's flat in Earl's Court a few minutes earlier. They were looking for somewhere to eat. At the junction of Redcliffe Square and Redcliffe Gardens, a traffic light turned red. He did not stop. A Volkswagen appeared in the oncoming lane. He swerved. The Lotus struck a stationary van. Suki Potier survived. The driver, Tara Brown, heir to one of the largest fortunes in Europe, son of the Guinness Dynasty, a young man whose life had looked from every possible angle like a promise, did not. The world would remember him, if it remembered him at all, as the man who may have inspired a Beatles song. But Tara Brown was not just a footnote to a day in the life. He was the son and grandson of a family whose name meant wealth on a scale most people could not imagine, and whose children kept dying in ways that wealth could not prevent. This is the story of the Guinness Dynasty, from the brewery that built an empire to the heirs who inherited everything except protection. 3 deaths, 3 branches of the same family, 20 years, and a pattern that no amount of money, title, or privilege could break. But to understand how a Guinness heir ended up dead at 21 on an empty London street, you have to go back much further than that night. Further than the Lotus Elan, further than swinging London, further than the parties and the famous friends and the carelessness that looked from the outside like freedom. You have to go back to the family itself, to the name, to what it meant to carry it and what it cost to children who did. Because Guinness was never just a brewery. It was a world. If you enjoy deeply researched stories about the private lives behind famous dynasties, take a moment to like and subscribe. There is much more to come. The public version of the Guinness story is the one most people already know, at least in outline. Arthur Guinness signed his lease at St. James's Gate in Dublin in 1759, a 9,000-year lease, which tells you something about the family's sense of permanence from the very beginning. Over the next century and a half, his descendants turned a single brewery into one of the largest industrial operations in the world. Sir Benjamin Lee Guinness restored St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin at his own expense. His son, Edward Cecil Guinness, who became the first Earl of Iveagh, expanded the business until it was producing millions of barrels a year and built a philanthropic empire alongside it. Housing trusts, hospitals, university endowments, some of the grandest private estates in Ireland and Britain. Farmley, one of the family's most celebrated properties, was eventually sold to the Irish state in 1999 for 29.2 million euros. That is the kind of family this was, the kind whose houses became government buildings after they were done with them. By the early 20th century, the Guinnesses were not just rich. They were embedded in the aristocracy, in Parliament, in the social architecture of both Ireland and England. The name appeared on brewery gates and on peerages, on charitable foundations, and on the guest list of every significant gathering in the British Isles. The public assumption was simple and understandable. If any family had solved the problem of generational survival, if any dynasty had figured out how to pass wealth and position and stability from one generation to the next without breaking something essential along the way, it was this one. That assumption was wrong. To understand what actually happened inside the family, the story has to narrow, not to Arthur Guinness, but to his great-great-grandson Edward Cecil, the first Earl of Iveagh, and the branches that grew from his line. From one branch came Ernest Guinness, whose 3 daughters, Aileen, Maureen, and Una, became known in the press as the Golden Guinness Girls. 3 sisters whose beauty, money, and social magnetism made them fixtures of interwar society. From another branch came Rupert Guinness, the second Earl of Iveagh, whose descendants would include Lady Henrietta Guinness and, through his eldest daughter, Honor, a granddaughter named Olivia Channon. That shared ancestry matters. It means the tragedies that followed were not random tabloid episodes scattered across unrelated people. They were repeated failures inside the same dynastic ecosystem, separated by decades but connected by blood, by money, and by something harder to name. An atmosphere that the family kept producing and that its children kept breathing. The youngest of the Golden Guinness girls was Una. She was born in London in 1910, the daughter of Ernest Guinness, and she grew up in a world of townhouses, country estates, and absolute social confidence. She was small, blonde, and by every account magnetic in a way that went beyond conventional charm. People who knew her described a woman who could hold a room not through volume or drama, but through a kind of enchantment, a gift for making the people around her feel that they were exactly where they were supposed to be. That gift would define her life. It would also, in ways she could not have foreseen, define the lives of her children. Una married first, briefly, Philip Kindersley. Then in 1936, she married Dominic Brown, the fourth Baron Oranmore and Brown, an Irish peer with a title that sounded grand and a temperament that was, by most accounts, quieter than hers. Her father gave her Lugala as a wedding gift, a Gothic revival lodge set against the Wicklow Mountains in County Wicklow, overlooking the black water of Loftay. It was a house that looked like it had been designed to exist inside a fairy tale, which is precisely the problem this story is about. With Dominic Brown, Una had 3 children. Garrick was born in 1939. A second son was born in 1943 and died at birth. He was never publicly named. And then came Tara, born on March 4th, 1945 in Dublin. The marriage did not last. Una and Dominic divorced in 1950 when Tara was 5 years old. There is something about that sequence worth sitting with for a moment. Before Tara Brown ever became a headline, before the car crash, the Beatles lyric, the tabloid shorthand of the Guinness curse, the family already had a dead child buried on the estate, a dissolved marriage, and a house that was accumulating grief even as it accumulated guests. Loss was not something that arrived later in this story. It was there from the beginning, written into the landscape. Tara Brown grew up between 2 worlds that should not have fit together, but somehow did, at least for a while. One world was old Irish aristocracy, the titles, the estate, the Anglo-Irish grandeur that came with being the son of a baron and the grandson of a Guinness. The other world was whatever Unas was building at Lugala, which was something else entirely. After her divorce, she turned the estate into a kind of permanent salon. As the guests who came and stayed and came back again were not just society friends. They were artists, writers, painters, musicians, misfits, and charmers of every kind. Lucian Freud painted there. Brendan Behan drank there. John Huston visited. The house had dim interiors and soft music and a view of the Black Lake that made everything feel suspended in time, as though the ordinary rules of consequence did not quite apply. For a child, that world would have felt magical. And it was magical, like sight. That was not an illusion. Una was genuinely gifted at making Lugala feel like the most interesting place on earth. But magic is not the same thing as safety, and a house full of fascinating adults is not the same thing as a house with structure. The children at Lugala inherited atmosphere. Whether they also inherited steadiness is a different question, and the answer, for at least one of them, turned out to be no. Garish, the elder brother, absorbed the artistic energy of the household and channeled it. He became a patron of Irish traditional music, co-founded Claddock Records, and later said that he had learned as much from his mother's guests as from any formal education. He was eccentric, devoted to Irish culture, and in his own way deeply rooted. He metabolized the Lugala atmosphere and made something durable from it. Tara metabolized it differently. He was bright, impulsive, generous, and the word appears in nearly every account, luminous. People who met him remembered the energy. He moved through rooms the way his mother did, drawing people in. But where Una had decades of social experience and the self-possession that came from being the one who controlled the household, Tara was young. Extraordinarily young. He was a teenager when the 1960s arrived, and the 1960s arrived at Lugala with particular force. By his late teens, Tara had become part of the London scene that would later be called Swinging London, a world of rock musicians, aristocratic dropouts, models, drugs, cars, parties, and a social fluidity that erased or seemed to erase the old boundaries between class and bohemia. He was friends with the Rolling Stones. He knew the Beatles. He moved between Dublin and London and Paris with the ease of someone who had money, connections, looks, and no particular reason to say no to anything. He was 18 years old when he married Noreen McSherry, known as Nicky, in 1963. He was a father of 2 sons before he turned 21. He was separated from his wife before he turned 22. He was due to inherit £1 million and a vast fortune in the mid-1960s, when he turned 25. And he never reached 25. There is a particular kind of biographical profile that emerges from every account of Tara Brown, and it is not the profile of a careless playboy, though that is how the press would later simplify him. It is the profile of a young man who had been given everything that money and social position could provide: access, beauty, charm, famous friends, a celebrated mother, a legendary house, and almost nothing that those things could not buy: privacy, boundaries, the kind of ordinary friction that teaches a person where the edges are. Tara had no edges. Every door opened, every room welcomed him, and the family that loved him had built a world so enchanting, so irresistible in its atmosphere, that the absence of guardrails was almost impossible to see until it was too late. Tara's 21st birthday party at Lugala in March of 1966 is the scene that captures all of this at once: the beauty and the fragility, the spectacle and the void beneath it. The guests arrived by private jet. Mick Jagger was there, Brian Jones was there, Anita Pallenberg was there. The Lovin' Spoonful played. The Wicklow Mountains stood behind the house, and the Black Lake reflected the lights, and inside there was music and champagne, and a young man at the center of it all who had everything the world could offer a 21-year-old in 1966. That party is a gift to narration because it looks from every angle like the promise of unlimited continuation. The young heir, surrounded by the most glamorous people of his generation, in the most beautiful setting his family could provide, with decades of wealth and privilege and possibilities stretching ahead of him. If you saw that scene in a photograph and knew nothing else, you would assume it was the beginning of a long and extraordinary life. It was 9 months before the end of it. And here is where the cracks, which were always there, become impossible to ignore. Una's world, for all its magic, was built on serial marriages, divorce, and a social life that functioned as a kind of magnificent distraction. The baby buried at Loftay was already part of the landscape. Tara's own marriage was already failing. He and Nikki had separated, and he was spending his nights in London with a 19-year-old model named Suki Potier. He had 2 small sons he was no longer living with. He had money he had not yet inherited and habits that money made frictionless. He was driving fast cars through the streets of a city that treated speed and youth and beauty as proof of invincibility. The family had created a stage set. Lugala was magnificent. The Guinness name opened every door. The social world Tara moved through was the most exciting in Europe. But none of it, not the house, not the name, not the money, not the mother who adored him, had produced the one thing that might have kept him alive: a reason to slow down, a boundary, a guardrail, someone who could say no and make it stick. By the autumn of 1966, Tara Brown was 21 years old, estranged from his wife, the father of 2 boys he rarely saw, a regular in the nightclubs and parties and late-night drives that defined his world. He was 9 months past the most spectacular birthday party anyone in his circle could remember. He had no career to speak of, no profession, no structure beyond the social calendar and the inheritance that was still 4 years away, and then came December. The 17th turned into the 18th. Tara and Suki Potier left a gathering at a friend's flat in Earl's Court sometime after midnight. They were hungry. They were looking for somewhere to eat. They climbed into the Lotus Elan and headed through South Kensington into the dark streets toward a red light that Tara either did not see or chose not to stop for. The family did not know it yet, but the stage set was about to collapse. And the sound it made would echo through 3 more decades of Guinness grief. The Lotus Elan reached the junction of Redcliffe Square and Redcliffe Gardens at speed. A traffic light was red. Tara either missed it or ignored it. An oncoming Volkswagen appeared. He swerved hard, and the car struck a stationary van. Suki Potier survived. She was 19 years old and sitting in the passenger seat, and she lived. Tara Brown did not. He was 21. It was the early hours of Sunday, December 18th, 1966. He died from injuries sustained in the crash. The cause was as ordinary as the evening that preceded it. 2 young people looking for food after midnight, a fast car, a red light, and a split second in which everything that glamour and money and the Guinness name could not protect against arrived without warning. The funeral was held at Lugala. Tara was buried on the shore of Loftay, beside the unnamed baby brother who had died at birth in 1943, and beside his half-sister. The graves were already there. The shoreline had been accumulating the family's dead before Tara was born, and now it held him too. He was 21, the father of two small boys he had been living apart from, the heir to a fortune he would never collect, and the youngest person buried in a row of graves that no one outside the family was meant to think about too carefully. The public, however, was about to think about Tara Brown in a way the family could not control. In early 1967, John Lennon read a newspaper account, most likely the coroner's report, or a summary of the inquest, and something in the details lodged in his mind. A man who had died in a car, a crowd that stood and stared, the lights that change. Whether Lennon was writing literally about Tara Brown or compositing several news stories has been debated for decades, but the connection was immediate and widely accepted. A Day in the Life, released on Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in June 1967, became one of the most celebrated songs in popular music. And embedded somewhere inside it was the echo of a 21-year-old Guinness heir who ran a red light in South Kensington and never came home. For the public, that was the story. A glamorous death, a Beatles song, a footnote in the mythology of the 1960s. For the family, the story was just beginning. What followed Tara's death was not private grief, it was a custody war. Tara's estranged wife, Nikki, and his mother, Una, fought publicly over his two sons, Dorian and Julian, both still very young. A judge eventually ruled that the boys would live with their grandmother. That decision tells you something about how dynastic families process tragedy. Grief becomes jurisdiction. Loss becomes a legal question about who controls the children, the estate, the narrative. Una, who had built Lugala into a world of beauty and enchantment and who had not been able to keep her own son alive inside it, was now granted custody of his children. The house that had failed to protect one generation was handed the next. And Lugala continued. The guests still came. The lake still reflected the mountains. Gareth Brown remained devoted to the estate and to his work preserving Irish music and culture. Una aged inside the world she had made, but something had shifted. The house was no longer just a place of gathering. It was a place where a son was buried, where grandsons were being raised without their father, and where the name Guinness carried a weight that had nothing to do with stout or philanthropy. That weight was about to get heavier. 12 years after Tara's death, the story moved to Italy and to a different branch of the same family tree. Lady Henrietta Guinness was born on August 19th, 1942, the daughter of Major Arthur Onslow, Edward Guinness, Viscount Elvedon, which made her a great-granddaughter of the first Earl of Eve, the same patriarch whose line had produced Una, Tara, and the world at Lugala. Henrietta's branch was different in style, less bohemian, more conventionally aristocratic. But the underlying architecture was the same. Vast wealth, immense social expectation, a name that opened every door and closed off certain kinds of ordinary happiness. By the accounts that survive, Henrietta was unhappy in the ways the family's money could not reach. She was described as depressed, romantically disappointed, searching for something that the Guinness name and the Guinness fortune could not provide. One line attributed to her has been repeated so often it has become almost an epitaph. "If I had been poor, I would have been happy." Whether she said those exact words in exactly that way is difficult to verify at this distance. What is not in dispute is the trajectory they describe. A woman born into one of the wealthiest families in Europe who experienced her inheritance not as freedom, but as a kind of prison. On February 3rd, 1978, Henrietta married Luigi Marinori. 3 months later, on May 3rd, she was dead. She fell from the Ponte del Torri, the ancient Roman bridge aqueduct at Spoleto in central Italy, a fall of roughly 80 meters. She was 35 years old. With Henrietta's death, the press had what it needed. Tara Brown in 1966. Lady Henrietta Guinness in 1978. Two violent deaths, two branches of the same family 12 years apart. Now newspapers began writing about a Guinness curse, as though the family's grief were hereditary, passed down through the bloodline alongside the money and the titles. Whether anyone inside the family used that phrase is doubtful, but from the outside looking in, the pattern was becoming difficult to dismiss as coincidence, and it was not finished. The next chapter came from yet another branch, not the Bohemian Lugala branch, not the aristocratic Elvedon branch, but the political one. Honor Guinness, the eldest daughter of Rupert Guinness, the second Earl of Iveagh, had married Henry Chips Channon, an American-born socialite and diarist who became a conservative member of Parliament. Their son, Paul Channon, continued the political tradition. By the 1980s, Paul Channon was a cabinet minister under Margaret Thatcher, a man who represented the most respectable face of the Guinness dynasty. Not brewery wealth or Irish grandeur or swinging London glamour, but establishment power. The House of Commons, government office, the carefully maintained surface of British public life. Paul Channon had a daughter. Her name was Olivia. She was born in 1964. And she was the proof, though no one wanted to see it that way, that the family had not solved the underlying problem. Different branch, different decade, different world. The same combination of privilege, exposure, famous name, and almost no protection from the ordinary dangers that famous names cannot deflect. Olivia Channon arrived at Christ Church, Oxford in the early 1980s. She was studying history. She was 22 years old by the time of her final exams in 1986. Bright, socially connected, moving through the upper reaches of Oxford student life, with a circle of friends whose surnames made headlines on their own. This was a particular kind of Oxford, not the scholarship students or the awkward intellectuals, but the aristocratic and wealthy set, the sons and daughters of politicians and peers and old money, for whom the university was as much a social stage as an academic institution. The culture around final exams at Oxford had its own rituals. When exams ended, students held celebrations called thrashings, parties that marked the release from weeks of intense pressure. Alcohol was expected. Drugs circulated. The atmosphere was one of earned abandon, the feeling that the worst was over and the night belonged to whoever wanted it most. On the evening of June 10th, 1986, Olivia Channon was celebrating the end of her history finals. The gathering took place in rooms at Christ Church, associated with Count Gottfried von Bismarck, a descendant of the German Chancellor and a part of the same gilded Oxford circle. The drinks included champagne mixed with Guinness stout, a cocktail called a black velvet. There was sherry. There were drugs. The room was full of young people whose families had given them everything except, apparently, a reason to believe the night could kill them. There is something about that room that the documentary needs to make the audience feel before it becomes infamous. It was an ordinary Oxford college room. Stone walls, old furniture, the particular institutional grandeur of Christ Church. Students had been drinking in the rooms like this for centuries. End of exams parties had happened here every year for as long as anyone could remember. Nothing about the evening, in its early hours, would have felt unusual. That is precisely the point. The danger did not announce itself. It never does. Olivia drank. She took drugs, heroin, amphetamines, and sedatives in a combination that the coroner would later describe in lethal terms. She was found dead at approximately 8 o'clock on the morning of June 11th in the rooms where the party had taken place. She was 22 years old. The inquest returned a verdict of misadventure, accidental death in plainer language. The coroner stressed the deadly nature of the drug combination and issued a broader warning about the dangers of mixing substances. The ruling meant that no one was held criminally responsible for Olivia's death, which was accurate in legal terms and devastating in every other sense. One detail that the eventual script must include, because it matters ethically. In the aftermath, the independent newspaper published an allegation that Sebastian Guinness, another member of the family, had supplied the drugs that caused Olivia's death. That allegation was false. The newspaper later issued a formal apology in a story about a family whose private tragedies were constantly distorted by public attention. That correction is not a footnote. It is an example of the very dynamic the documentary is describing. A famous name turning private grief into public spectacle, and the spectacle producing its own casualties in the form of false accusations and reputational damage that no retraction can fully undo. The aftermath of Olivia's death was immediate and enormous. The press descended on Oxford. Tabloids ran stories about the university as a playground for privileged, reckless youth. Olivia's funeral was attended by senior members of the royal family. Her father, Paul Channon, was not merely a bereaved parent. He was a serving cabinet minister, which meant that his grief was conducted entirely in public, under the scrutiny of political rivals, journalists, and a country that had opinions about what his daughter's death said about wealth, class, and the failures of the ruling elite. By 1986, the Guinness family had buried Tara Brown at 21. It had buried Lady Henrietta Guinness at 35. And now it had buried Olivia Channon at 22. 3 deaths across 3 branches of the same dynasty, spanning 20 years. The settings were different each time. A London street, an Italian bridge, an Oxford college room. The details were different, the substances were different, but the underlying architecture was the same. Beautiful young people, born into extraordinary privilege, moving through worlds where their famous name opened every door and protected them from nothing. The family story kept producing the same contrast: magnificent setting, ordinary vulnerability, dreadful ending. What remains now is fragmented, and the fragmentation is itself the final chapter. The brewery that built the dynasty is no longer a family company. Guinness merged into Diageo in 1997, and the name on the pint glass belongs to a multinational corporation, not to any Guinness heir. Farmley, the grand estate that Edward Cecil Guinness built into a showpiece, became an Irish state guest house after the government purchased it in 1999. The formal head of the family line is Arthur Edward Rory Guinness, the 4th Earl of Eve, who serves as a trustee of the Eve Trust, a philanthropic body that still operates in Dublin with Guinness family involvement, a reminder that the dynasty's public legacy did outlast its private coherence. Among the more visible modern descendants, Daphne Guinness remains active as a fashion and arts figure. Ivana Lowell, whose mother was Maureen Guinness's daughter, published a memoir, Why Not Say What Happened, that remains one of the sharpest accounts of dysfunction in a later Guinness-connected generation. Tara Brown's sons, Dorian and Julian, appear in public genealogical records but have maintained very low profiles. Reliable recent sources do not establish where they live or what they do, and the script should respect that privacy rather than speculate. The cultural afterlife of the family is now richer than it has ever been. Paul Howard's 2016 biography, I Read the News Today, oh boy, gave Tara Brown the detailed biographical treatment he had never received during the decades when he existed mainly as a footnote to a Beatles song. Netflix's House of Guinness, which premiered in 2025 as an 8-episode drama starring Anthony Boyle and Louis Partridge, dramatized the family's 19th century inheritance battles. But it stopped well short of the 20th century tragedies. The earlier story is the origin myth. The later story, the one this documentary tells, is the cost. This story does not prove that wealth destroys families, and it would be dishonest to pretend it does. What it reveals is something more specific and harder to reduce to a phrase. The Guinness heirs inherited money, titles, estates, and a name that was recognized in every country where stout was poured. They also inherited atmosphere, the particular emotional climate of houses where beauty was abundant and supervision was not, where glamour substituted for structure, where the adults were brilliant and magnetic and almost never boring, and where the children grew up believing that the enchantment of the rooms they lived in was the same thing as safety. It was not. The public saw Black Stout and Castle Gates and Beatles lyrics. The private reality was graves on a lakeshore, accumulating quietly, one generation after the next. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe for more deeply researched family histories.